Hello everyone, Adi Olvera. Thanks for being here with us. I'm a Concord resident and co-founder of Defund Concord PD, and I'm so excited to be with all of you here today. I want to recognize that we are on the land that belongs to the Ohlone people and the Chukan and Saklan people of Miwok people. Land that was taken from them, it was stolen. They exist today. Their culture, their knowledge and wisdom is passed on from one generation to the next. And we're committed to making space in our conversations for Indigenous people's cultures, teachings, and concerns. And as you walk in life and you are engaging with Indigenous people, please make space for them to grow and have leadership in the space and bring their knowledge back to other groups that you convene in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you everyone for taking some time to recognize the land that we occupy. I see a lot of new faces here on Zoom and in our registrant lists, so I just want to take a couple minutes for us to tell you a little bit about Defund Concord PD and why we are doing this webinar series, and then after that, I promise you'll be able to hear from our wonderful panelists. June, do you want to take it away?
Thank you. Welcome everybody. My wife Mara and I started this group in June of this year. Like many others across the country this summer, it was clear to us that we needed to become more involved with protecting vulnerable communities at a local level. At the direction for the Movement for Black Lives, we dug into our own city's budget. We live here in Concord, and very quickly we saw that Concord's budget did not reflect our values. The staggering difference between how much money is going to police versus how much money is invested in our community through social services is frankly unacceptable. We started looking to existing organizations in the area to get involved, but we didn't see anyone specifically working on budget equity in Concord, so that's where we decided to really jump in. We met Addie and Andrea, and with them, we really got to work. And we started building community in our work and gathering like-minded community members to help make their voices heard. So we have pushed back on our city council here on several issues regarding police spending, as well as funding for vital social services, especially in a pandemic that disproportionately affects folks who are already struggling. We have joined in on actions in neighboring cities who are also fighting this fight. We have joined with allies to work on a county level as well. A handful of elected officials claim they understand the need to reimagine public safety, but their voting record and their actions tell a different story. It's clear that many of the elected officials we have across the region do not understand what equitable public safety and racial equity really mean. It's time for a change. Andrea?
Thank you, June. So here in Concord, we have been pressuring City Council to make the needed changes and working to build up our community members to help apply the pressure in hope that they would make bold moves to solve racial equity issues in Concord. For a while, it seemed that our mayor, Tim McGallion, was interested in holding these formal council study sessions to hear from academic experts and that focus on racial equity and macro social work, and nonprofits who are creating public safety by providing for the basic needs of residents. But they never followed through. So we decided to take the matters into our own hands and host these important conversations ourselves. So here we are.
Our goal tonight is to talk about what it would look like if our local governments, from city council to park departments, really paid attention to the racial equity and help make their cities safer and more livable for working class families and historically criminalized communities. We have selected a few candidates running for office in Concord and the greater Contra Costa area who are true advocates and for racial equity and budget justice, and have a vision for local government that is significantly better than what we have now. We're going to hear about how they got here, what change they want, and what they need from their fellow government leaders to make this happen.
On our panel today, we have Keisha and Nzewi, and she's a candidate for the Mount Diablo Unified School District in the Area 3. We also have Tamisha Walker, candidate for the Antioch City Council District 1. We have Hope Johnson, candidate for City Council District 2. We have Michael Samson, candidate for the Walnut Creek City Council. We also have Eduardo Torres, candidate for the Ambrose Recreation and Parks District Board. And we have Jovanka Beckles, candidate for the AC Transit Board, Ward 1.
Now, I know each of you have a unique history, work experience, activism, and advocacy. I want to start with Tamisha and go around and talk about the work you were doing before you decided to run for the local government position. What parts of that will you bring with you into your position if elected? And how important is this type of advocacy and background in effectively understanding and supporting our community? So Tamisha, if you could start, and then we'll go with Jovanka, and then I'll name a few others. And please unmute yourself to speak.
Good evening, everyone. Tamisha Walker, co-founder, executive director of Safe Return Project here in Contra Costa County, and I am a candidate for Antioch City Council District 1. My gender pronouns are she and hers, and all of my access needs are being met in this meeting right now. The work that I have been honored and blessed to do over the last 10 years with the Safe Return Project has been focused on re-enfranchising individuals and communities impacted by criminalization through participatory action research practices, grassroots organizing, and policy advocacy to stabilize individuals in a community and their families post incarceration, as well as working at the county level to on justice reinvestment strategies, which diverts millions of dollars away from the criminal and justice system back into our communities to be able to meet the needs and curb the community to prison pipeline through providing adequate services to prevent folks from going back to incarceration once they come home, but to also make sure that people who shouldn't be criminalized in the first place, like are homeless, people with mental health and substance dependency issues, could have the services that they need. That is the work that I've had a great opportunity to do over the last 10 years, as well as investing in reducing violence in our communities and having deep discussions about healing and reconciliation. I'm running for this city council seat because I'm a resident of Antioch, and in my short time being here, I have seen our elected leaders overlook a lot of these challenges and also attempt to use police powers to address issues that are really health issues and issues that we should be looking at public policy around and investing more of our resources into keeping people in community and not misusing police powers to address issues just because we want to ignore it or not deal with it. And so that's why I'm running for this seat. What will I bring to Antioch? I mean, as a resident and an executive director of a nonprofit that's invested in serving people impacted by incarceration, poverty, and racial disparity, I've already had an opportunity to bring some of that work, those networks and resources and collaborations that I've been able to build up over the last 10 years to the community just as a resident and an organizer. And I believe that if I'm elected, I will be able to increase those efforts as a city council member to help us reshape our local government, have a balanced budget that meets the needs of our community, and be able to reimagine public safety in a way where we can also hold law enforcement accountable, but not overfund police services at the risk of underfunding what people say they really need and want in the community for a better quality of life.
Yeah, my name is Eduardo Torres. Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Concord Defund PD for putting this on. I'm a lifelong resident of Bay Point. Have lived here all my life, unincorporated Bay Point. And I started doing organizing work with ACE around parks and recs issues in our community. But for those folks who aren't too familiar with Bay Point, there's a lot of issues here. We don't have a police department. We have a sheriff's, which we don't have a great relationship with. And I'll just say, right now that, you know, I got harassed a lot as a young man by the police. I've been racially profiled, not just here in Bay Point, but in other cities, just for looking the way I look, and so this conversation is very important to me. And so the work that I've been doing in my community around Parks and Rec led me to work in an organization called Tenants Together, which is a statewide organization that advocates for tenant rights. And in the last 4 years, I've been working in, I started working in Concord around tenant right issues, organizing in Concord, helping tenants there. And then eventually, as my role grew bigger in the organization, I've been doing work around regional support for all the groups who are on the ground, doing all the great housing justice work. And so, just seeing everything that's been happening, I think regionally and nationwide and around the state, this election definitely pushed me to run for office because, we have incumbents who aren't very responsive to the community's needs. And when we have an impoverished community, a community that's been, really ignored for, all my life, that's all I can remember, we've been really ignored. I think it's time for us to, especially, people like myself in this position of working for social justice, to raise our voices and make, make that opportunity to have a space for people in my community to speak up and bring their issues. So, so I'm just really excited to have this conversation with everyone and figure out what we could do collectively. How can we support the work that's happening, not just in Concord, but also in Bay Point and Antioch, and all these other communities that, we all share, borders with. Let's figure out how we could help each other and how we could really defund the police and put some money back into the community. We need to invest in our communities and not divest. And I definitely appreciate this conversation. Happy to be here tonight.
I thank you for sharing, because everything you said resonates with me, especially about, the need to raise community voices, and it's something that you're doing amazing there in Bay Point.
So to be frank, I've never had any interest in politics before, and I've been a teacher. I've been a music teacher, never really had any political aspirations or anything like that, but I was galvanized pretty strongly by what I saw in Minneapolis, what happened to George Floyd and the ensuing uprising. It was the uprising that really inspired me, seeing that the people can actually stand up and take power back. It kind of reawakened in me the idea that that you can make really big changes at the local level. It gave me hope. And so I was like, well, okay, let's see what I can do in my community. And that's when I just started getting involved in activism, mainly attending protests. I attended the protest on June 1st in Walnut Creek, which many of you may know was quite a violent affair. It was a very peaceful protest. 3,000 people took to the streets. I was one of the protesters who took to the freeway. And I had my knees on the ground and my hands in the air chanting, "Hands up, don't shoot," when they shot tear gas at us. And, my mom was on the freeway with us that day as well. She's a retired kindergarten teacher with one arm, and she ended up getting hit with a police projectile on the side of her chest, and she got a bruise the size of a dinner plate that lasted for at least a week. And so I'm like, we didn't pose a threat to the police. And you hear about these things happening in big cities, but like Walnut Creek, really? And that really pissed me off. And then when I attended the subsequent city council meeting to see what their response would be, I was just shocked and disappointed by what I saw from the Walnut Creek City Council. Because I figured that the Walnut Creek City Council would be a slightly more conservative body, but I was not prepared for the level at which they would basically be cop apologists, and they were, working overtime and bending over backwards to justify the behavior of these cops, despite the fact that the community had spoken up at these city council meetings for 7, even 8 hours to make their voices heard, and they were just being routinely ignored. So that really bothered me, and at that point, I had been protesting for a while, and I've been protesting ever since. There's a daily protest in Walnut Creek, actually, every day from 12 to 1 p.m. in front of the city hall, and I've been attending and leading that protest for a few months now. And it was around, maybe mid-June or late June, early July, where I decided, nobody on the city council is prepared to stand up for progressive change. So somebody has to, right? Somebody has to. Mm-hmm. And I looked around and I didn't see anybody who was. So I was like, well, if it's not if it's not me, then who's it going to be? So I decided to put my name in the ring. And I figured I was in a good position to do it, you know, because of the fact that I was passionate about this. In addition to the social justice side of thing, I'm also really interested in a lot of the more boring stuff, you know, zoning laws and height ordinances and those sorts of things. I'm actually really interested in because I see the impact that they have on the way we live. And so I just want to make a difference in my city in some way. And I figured, well, I never thought about running for city council, but seeing politicians like Bernie and AOC made me realize that I could run for office, and it just all kind of lined up, and I figured I kind of have to.
Very much like everyone who's spoken so far, Michael, you're so unapologetic about the work that you're doing in Walnut Creek, and I just want to thank you for that. Jovanka.
Thank you all. I really appreciate you putting on this forum. This is I think wonderful, and I appreciate the invitation to speak about you know, my history of working towards social justice issues in Richmond. You know, as a former council member, I had the honor of serving my city in that capacity, and as a result of being on the council at the right time, where we had enough, I would say, revolutionaries, progressive activists on the city council, where we were able to really bring about the kind of justice, racial equity in our city. Had the honor of working with the Safe Return Project, Tamisha's organization, where we collaborated and worked together to bring about the most progressive ban-the-box policy in the nation, which is, some of you may or may not know, the ban-the-box policy basically is fairness in hiring. And what that does is it creates an opportunity for people who are coming back into society, you know, formerly incarcerated individuals coming back into society, would not have to answer the question of whether or not they've ever been convicted, you know, of a felony, you know, which creates an inability for folks who have made a change and want to work. It gives them an opportunity for employment. In addition, raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We were one of the first cities to do that in the state of California. We were the first city in 30 years to pass a local rent control ordinance. And that's important. All of these things are important. Even policies around police accountability was one of the ways that we worked in Richmond to bring about racial justice and equity. Because when you hold police accountable, you know, when you don't take their money, you don't have to sit there and defend bad behavior in police, because now you owe them a favor. So we were able to bring about police accountability. We, you know, we voted against militarizing our police in Richmond. And so that's really something I feel that I'm really proud of, because all of these issues are racial justice issues, right? When people aren't able to pay their rent, when people don't get paid enough, the majority of people that these issues affect are people of color, are Black and brown people, particularly when we're talking about formerly incarcerated people, where Black folk are disproportionately incarcerated at a greater rate than white folk or any other people. You know, these are all racial justice issues that I fought for in Richmond, and I'm going to continue to fight for as a candidate or as the next AC Transit Ward 1 director, where my platform has to, well, our platform is about racial equity, where we can actually make AC Transit an engine of justice. Right now, 80% of the drivers are Black. The riders are Black and brown folks, 70%. And so I will work towards helping to make AC Transit, continue to make it free. It's currently free in these times, and I want to keep it that way. We can keep it that way, because when we do that, you know, when people are able to move about freely, that gives folks dignity and self-worth. And so these policies that I'll be working towards are all about just equity, justice. When I talk about bringing forward a Green New Deal for AC Transit, we're talking about employment, people being able to work, people being able to move about. We know that data shows that when transit systems are free, it reduces greenhouse gases because people then get out of their cars and onto a public transportation system.
Thank you, Jovanka. I know that you have a history of organizing and galvanizing all of Richmond and the Bay Area. Your work in the community is truly a national model, and every city that is not actively engaging its community should be looking at you and your peers in Richmond for advice, because we have to stop the bad behavior from police in our community. So thank you. Hope, if you could go.
Sure. I'm Hope Johnson. I'm running for Concord City Council in District 2. It's our first District 2 election. It's in an area where I grew up, and my parents have lived here since 1967. I've moved around. I went to UCLA, and I lived in San Francisco for 10 years. My whole life, I've sort of been, I'm not one to stay silent, and it's always hard for me to stay silent in the face of any injustice, even in school. And so that's sort of been something that I carried with me around. And when I was in San Francisco, I learned a lot about politics. Politics there is a blood sport, and you either learn it or you get sucked up by it. And I was pretty inspired when they started allowing gay marriages at City Hall. I was very excited that somebody would actually take the time to do something and be brave enough, even though people were yelling at them not to do it. And it was fantastic. It was one of the greatest love fests ever. Everybody was happy. Everybody was talking about the changes that could come about, and the economic growth that would come. And I thought that was great, and I was pretty inspired by that. So then I learned more when I started volunteering in different campaigns out there. And one of them was with Jeff Adachi, the public defender. And that's where I started to learn about all of the racial and economic injustices that were in the criminal justice system. He was one of the first people to talk about, should we abolish cash bail? At the time, people thought he was kind of crazy, but they explained, if you're poor, you stay in jail. If you're wealthy and you can be bailed out, you get bailed out. And people think that if you're in jail, you must have done something wrong. They don't understand that it's just you didn't have as much money as the other guy. Most of my career has been in the legal field. I did go to law school for a year and I didn't like it. I went to UC Berkeley, but when I got out, it was easy to keep going and doing legal work. So I still do that. I do legal analyst work. And I think that what that helps me do is figure out how to analyze what's going on, figure out what kind of questions are effective. When I came back to Concord, of course, I started going to the Concord meetings because of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. I live close enough to where the toxic cleanup is going to affect my neighborhood. And I had watched the people out at Hunters Point. I learned a lot from the people at Hunters Point. I was shocked, like a lot of people are, to learn that the biggest percentage of homeowners in San Francisco was at Hunters Point. So it was a lot of Black families. And most people would never have known that. And they didn't care about Hunters Point, the rest of San Francisco, until they wanted to take it away from the Black families who owned their homes there. And that's when they started cleaning up. And I saw a lot of people get sick, and I didn't want that to happen here. And in the process of listening to all of that, I heard a lot about how Concord doesn't have enough money for social services. They don't have enough money for homeless services. They don't have enough money for simple things like fixing the roads or to help with the schools. And it just seemed, I just took one look and said, wow, you're spending all of your money criminalizing all of those things with the police department. And this was years and years ago. This was in 2014 and 2015. And I'm thrilled to be here. I thank everyone that's here for doing this, because it's nice to have other people asking those same questions. I understand that, as you know, a middle-aged white woman, I was privileged to be able to ask those questions and not get the same kind of pushback I might if I was some other ethnicity. That's not why I did it, but I do recognize that I'm hoping that I can bridge a gap so that people can see that, you know, it's not, it covers all of us. I feel that this movement is about people who've been left out of public safety, which is something that I learned about from the people that taught me a lot of stuff in San Francisco. I also sat on, I was a chair of the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force out there, and basically we held hearings asking the city to be transparent and accountable to those people that it served. So I think that I want to be on the Concord City Council because 3 minutes is not enough, and I don't get the opportunity to ask questions. I understand what kinds of questions to ask and how to actually get the results that we want and not just punish somebody. We're not interested in punishing people or taking away the budget money just to be mean. Just an example, as we met, you know, with the chief of police, and I asked him if he could track the data, and he was very reluctant. I said, if we got you a way to do it, would you do it? And he wouldn't answer. And I would like to be able to have a voice that continues that conversation.
Thank you, Hope. One of the things that I've learned from you is your fierce advocacy. You don't wait for anyone, and you don't wait for anyone to take action. Even when there's no one watching, you're out there making sure that there's transparency and that someone is lifting the voices for the most vulnerable. So thank you for that. Thank you for always calling out our city council when they're doing something wrong. Keisha.
My name is Keisha Nzewi, and I'm shout out to my mother who's on the phone. I grew up in the Central Valley in the small town of Concord, California, but I've spent all of my adult life here in the East Bay. And I certainly didn't come into this year imagining at all that I would be running for office or for school board in Mount Diablo. And like many of you, it was the convergence of so many things in June between COVID and the racial reckoning and racial uprisings that made it the absolute right time. So what I do in my real life, in my day job, what I do currently is I'm a public policy director for the California Child Care Resource and Referral Network. And I've worked in policy advocacy for the majority of my career, though I was a community organizer at the beginning of my career. So I've worked on many different issues. Most immediately, previously, was anti-hunger and anti-poverty. So in my work, both in anti-hunger and child care, it seems to be my role. One, I'm usually the only Black woman in the room, the only Black person in the room among advocates on these issues. And it's become my job, whether it was hunger or childcare, to point out the racist roots of our system. And especially in childcare, I think people are surprised, but they just don't think about it because the racist foundation of our childcare system and why it can be such that people are so poorly paid and disrespected, the people who care for our youngest children, is that it started with enslaved women caring for the white babies for free. And then it continued with Black women who were no longer enslaved, but were still paid either extremely poorly or not paid at all, because white families claimed that the Black women who were caring for their children in their household were doing it out of love. This is real. And then, which is why in history, and once we get to the 20th century, domestic work is left out of the fair labor laws. And then so Black women and then women, Latinx women are the majority of domestic workers in the mid-20th century. And then as more immigrant women enter the field, it's still easy to keep wages depressed. And as we move into welfare, as we move into the myths of welfare, of the welfare queen, and then you go into the 90s into welfare reform, all of that is all of those things that Black people especially are poor because they're lazy and they're just trying to get over on the government, and they're trying to defraud the government and take you, good taxpayers' money, all of that actually also lives in our childcare system and how we treat families who need help paying for childcare and providers who are caring for those children. So that's what I do in the day. And all summer especially, I feel like a lot of you, I'm sure, have felt more emboldened in a way that we haven't felt before, even though we have all lived through, everyone, as far as I can tell, is old enough to have lived through the last 15 or 20 years of police violence or more, 30. It's never, like, I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's never felt like it does now, that we can actually make a difference. I was about to say, that we can actually fuck shit up and burn everything down and make things happen. And so in my own work this summer, I noticed that I used words like implicit or explicit bias or equity, and that's not the right word to use because it's just downright racism, and it's usually anti-Black racism. And so in the childcare world, which is really led by older white women who started because they came into the workforce in the 70s, and that's how this all started. They built this racist system, and now we can really say it and say, white women, step back, because you cannot be part of unbuilding this system and rebuilding it right. I've been saying burning it down, but someone used unbuilding the other day, so I'm trying to be less violent. So what I feel like I bring to this position, should I be elected to the Mount Diablo Unified School Board, that's what I'm running for, is that I'm really a quite unexpected force, because my everything about me naturally, my demeanor, everything is just quiet. I don't necessarily speak. I don't have the need to speak up a lot or to hear myself talking, but I do have a need to say what's right at the right time, even if it's really hard. And I do that very well, even if I tell my daughter, my hands are sweaty, my armpits are sweaty, my voice may shake, but we have to speak up when no one else will. And I think that in the Mount Diablo Unified School District, I believe that there's definitely a lot of parents, teachers, staff, administrators who want to fight racism within the school district. And there's a lot of talk, but there's not a lot of action. In fact, there's basically no action. And so my role would be to make there be action, because we've waited long enough. We don't need more studies. We don't need more work groups. We don't need any of that. We know what's wrong and we know what's right. And so we should do whatever it takes to fix it. So that's my goal and plan at the most difficult time to enter doing anything with schools.
Keisha, thank you so much for that. And I agree with you that we can't wait any longer. We have to look upon ourselves to fix this. And this is why we're making the spaces to have these conversations and promote them as much as we can online when we're in this pandemic. It's really crucial that we get the word out. I want to say that I'm really impressed with all of you, Tamisha, Jovanka, Eduardo, Michael, Keisha. Hope all of you have networks, you have professional and life experiences that are going to make you an amazing representative in office. So thank you for that. Now I will pass it on to June.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our candidates. That introduction was hugely helpful, and it's great to get to know all of you a little bit better. So thank you for sharing with us. Moving into our discussion now, our first kind of discussion topic is, what is the history of your city in working towards social justice, and what is their current position on racial equity? Where do you perceive the issues or successes regarding racial equity or achieving racial equity in your community or within the specific department that you're running for? What are your short-term and long-term goals to correct these issues or to build on the successes? So we will start with Jovanka first for this one.
I would have gotten an F on my report card for this one because I think I answered that question.
Yeah, you did with your intro. That's true.
With my intro, right? I can, so I'm wondering then
if you have a couple of your short-term and long-term goals for the position that you're running for, that would be great to hear.
Yes, my short-term goal is to ensure that, and this is something that, pardon me, this is something that I've been able to collaborate with the community, and I really, that's something that I think is absolutely critical for the success of any person running for office, is that we have to, we're not in those positions on our own. We didn't get there on our own, and so we can't have these goals that we create on our own. We have to work with the community. And so one of the things in working with the community and the riders and drivers is that, they want to just make sure that everyone's safe. And so that's my number one goal. That's my short-term goal, is to make sure that the drivers are safe and that the riders are safe. And that being, for AC Transit, to ensure that they all have PPE. So the drivers and the riders, and I spoke up about that at the MTC meetings as well as the AC Transit meetings. Not just me, but again, the community alongside us. And making sure that there are hand sanitizers on every bus, and that has happened. And so it's really encouraging to see what we can do when we stick together, when we fight together and join forces. So that's first and foremost, as well as having AC Transit continue to be fare free. There's talk now, the board is considering returning back to collecting fares. And I don't see that that's something that will benefit the majority of folks who depend on this public transportation. And so my short-term goal is to ensure that AC Transit stays fare-free from this point on. 100 cities across the world has already done that. And if they can do that, then certainly California, the richest economy in the world, right? We can do that, and we can do that. I know there are skeptics out there who feel, well, how are you going to do that? Well, we do that by taxing the rich. How about they start paying their fair share of taxes for the first time in ever? How about that? And so I always want to plug Prop 15 because we need to ensure that, please vote yes on that, because these mega billion-dollar corporations have not paid their fair share of taxes since 1975. And this would be a way that we can fund systems like AC Transit, where $24 million would be allocated to it. And that's how we would keep it fare-free.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Eduardo, you're up next.
Yeah, so as far as history here in Bay Point, there hasn't been a lot of movement or organizing that I've seen, but in particular the last 7 or 8 years, when we started organizing around the parks and issues here in Bay Point, is when we started seeing movement here. One of my goals with our campaign was to elevate campaigns here in Bay Point and let people know that there are positions here that people could run for, but at the same time use it as an opportunity to talk about other issues happening here in Bay Point. We are an impoverished community. I can't stress that enough. We're well below the statewide average on the poverty line. Our schools are consistently, our elementary, middle schools are consistently testing some of the lowest scores in the state. And so we have equity issues around education as well. And so these are all things that affect us here in Bay Point. And my goal with this campaign, besides winning the seat, was also letting people know that there's other things that we need to work on. Pacifica High School was a high school here that existed in Bay Point, and it closed down in 1976. Since then, we've been shipping, kids into high school that go into high school, into Mount Diablo High School, 6 miles away, when our closest high school geographically is 3 miles away in Pittsburgh. If that's not, if that's not inequitable, I don't know what is. I mean, I can't imagine, telling some parents at Walnut Creek that they're going to close one of their schools and you're going to have to ship your kid 6 miles away. That would never happen, right? But it's happening to us here in Bay Point. And I appreciated that Jovanka mentioned Prop 15 because, as I mentioned, I'm 41, going to be 42 this year. That law, Prop 13, passed in 1978 when I was born. So I've seen my community go from from bad to worse in that time, especially when it comes to education. And so I think it's super important for our community to get involved on a lot of these issues, especially because it is around social justice and it is about equity. It's about land use. It's about a lot of things that are affecting us. I mean, even with when we talk about pollution in the environment, this delta that we sit on here in Bay Point has been polluted so much over the decades that, you know, we have high amounts of cancer rates here as well. So there's a lot of things that we have to tackle. And so I'm hoping that, you know, from this campaign, people will open their eyes and realize that there's things that we need to fight for. And I really hope to bring that voice for people in Bay Point. Some of the short-term goals that I have include, you know, within the park district jurisdiction that I'm running for, is improving safety, is improving lighting around our parks, is improving getting water fountains. I mean, we had to really fight to get new bathrooms at our community park. And that's really ridiculous that we couldn't even get them to talk about it and put it on the agenda. We couldn't get the board to do that. And we had to fight to get a community pool open. And we had to fight for almost a decade for that to happen. And these are issues that, to me, just show you how much problems there are here in Bay Point. That, you know, when you have your elected officials who aren't listening to you, there needs to be some change. So some of those short-term goals include improving the safety around our parks, you know, getting some drinking fountains and bathrooms and anything else that makes parks equitable. The long-term goal for me is, you know, and it might be unpopular to some people in this community or even in Pittsburgh, but I don't think we can sustain ourselves by ourselves any longer. We're a community of 20,000 people, plus 20,000 people living here. We can no longer rely on the county. We can no longer rely on the school district. We need to look at a possibility of maybe even merging with the city of Pittsburgh, because that's the only way that I feel, and I will say reclaim our name, West Pittsburgh, because that's what we used to be called. We were called West Pittsburgh, and we want to be part of Pittsburgh again. We want to be part of all the exciting things that's happening in Pittsburgh, and also, you know, create opportunities for investment in our community, because it's not happening. The county's not helping us. So those are just some of the things that I could go on and on all night about. But because, like I said, you know, no one else is talking about this in our community. I'm hoping to bring a voice and continue fighting for equity and social justice here in Bay Point.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Really appreciate it. Michael, you're going to be up next.
Thank you. And thank you, Eduardo, for shouting out Walnut Creek. You know, you mentioned that, you know, it's just unthinkable that, you know, a situation would happen where a Walnut Creek High School would close and then those students would then be expected to go to a high school 6 miles away. In fact, that logic will carry even further. You know, in 2018, the Acalanes Unified School District actually banned inter-district transfers. So not only are we not going to be in a position where we would send students out like that, but we're also putting up barriers to reject students from other districts, which, you know, is, I guess, in character. Thankfully, though, because of the work of student activists, that policy has just recently been reversed, and Acalanes Unified is accepting transfer students again. But the fact that almost anyone is able to point so quickly to Walnut Creek as being an example of a community that is, how should I say, a wealthy white community that chooses to insulate itself from the problems of the greater Bay Area. And I just don't think that is acceptable anymore. I mean, Walnut Creek has always been, from its founding, that kind of town, kind of a white haven. You know, it's a perfect example of redlining. And when redlining was no longer kosher anymore, you couldn't explicitly discriminate based on race, suddenly housing stops being developed. And it's like, oh, that's a little bit interesting how that happens. We're starting to see more development now, but we're inheriting that kind of racist legacy, kind of. It's definitely a racist legacy. And, you know, that's kind of been the history of Walnut Creek, has been, you know, it's been a white haven. And so when we're talking about activism and the history of activism, and here, you know, people have generally moved here to avoid that sort of thing. But recently, many of you guys may be aware of Miles Hall. Miles Hall was killed by the Walnut Creek Police Department on June 2nd, 2019. So just a year and 3 months ago. A Black man who was going through a mental health crisis, and he needed medical attention. You know, this is a perfect example of what this discussion is all about, which is, you know, mental health crisis response. Why are the police responding to mental health crisis, right? It has it right in the name, mental health. So this is a health issue. But the police are tasked with responding to mental health crisis because we don't give that responsibility, you know, we don't treat it as a health issue. And so on June 2nd, 2019, the Walnut Creek Police Department rolled up, and despite the fact that the Hall family had developed a relationship with the WCPD over the course of 2 years, they have no idea how to handle mental health crisis response. So they escalated tensions, demonstrating over and over again that they have no idea what they're doing when it comes to mental health crisis response, and eventually they escalated it to the point where they fired their guns at Miles Hall. And so in the wake of that event, I think that woke up a lot of members of this community to the recognition that the problems that plague policing in the United States are not just confined to big cities like New York or Baltimore or Chicago or even Oakland. You know, they happen everywhere. Every city in the United States is dealing with these issues. And Walnut Creek is not immune. So I think there's beginning to be a bit of an uncomfortable awakening in Walnut Creek. As I mentioned, I'm protesting in support of justice for Miles Hall and police, in defunding the police in front of City Hall every day. And every day we meet resistance. We get middle fingers, we get people shouting us down. We've even gotten people threatening to kill us. So it just goes to show that, you know, the racism in Walnut Creek is deep, and it impacts these issues pretty substantially. And so I think that's one of the reasons where I feel that I need to not just stand up in support of issues like defunding the police and taking responsibilities that they aren't prepared to handle effectively out of their hands, but also that I need to just be blunt about it, because this community kind of needs to hear it. And the more you talk, the more you realize that first there's the resistance, but also there's a lot of people in this community who are hearing this stuff for the first time from people who are running for office, and they're thinking, finally, there's somebody who is just saying it as it is. And, you know, I don't want to take any credit for that, because it just is what it is. And the work I'm doing is only an extension of the work of activists like the Hall family and their friends and supporters. So I just want to take that fight to City Hall.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. Keisha, you're next.
Okay, you can hear me. Good. Okay. I don't know. I've never done Zoom on the phone and the camera, so I think there's a lot of hope. I'm muted. Oh, okay. I think there's a whole lot of low-hanging fruit in our school district. The first part of the question is, like, what's our history around social justice? And I don't have a long history within this district, but what's the history around racial justice? My very short history, 3 years in this district, I can tell you our family has had moments where I'm like, wait, this is 2018, not 1918. And as I've had the opportunity to speak with many families in Area 3, our experience isn't unique. And then the opportunity to interact with teachers and whatnot, there's nothing unique about our experience. So racial issues are top of mind for so many people, and they are very real in our district. Our district passed an equity resolution early this summer in June, and so it says a lot of great things in it, but there is no action steps laid out in it on how we can actually achieve racial justice within our schools. So some of the low-hanging fruit is we're out of school right now. We're distance learning, I mean, and many cities withdrew their funding of school resource officers this year in 2020. And so, so that by default means that at the moment there's no police in the schools. But I think that when we return back to school, there should be police-free schools. because there's no reason for them to be there. We need to use that and utilize the funding that cities contributed and that the school district contributed for the things that help kids and help families be whole and healthy. So whether that's school counselors, school nurses, actual social workers, and other mental health professionals, and supporting teachers to be able to do their best job. Another low-hanging fruit is, in my opinion, is creating a system that allows people to report any incidents of bias and racism, and to know that it was heard, and to know that an action is being taken towards resolution. Because in my own experience, none of that happened. Nothing happened, to be frank. And that's unacceptable, and that's really harmful for both students and the whole community, whether it's a staff person or a teacher, an administrator. They should know that their voice is heard, that their complaint, that their harm is real, and that something should be done about it. And then a lot has been, I've heard a lot this year, not just from running, but just in general. There's a lot of attention on curriculum, especially because a bill just passed around requiring ethnic studies, and our state superintendent has put a lot of focus on this as well. But I think that we should really embrace multicultural education. It shouldn't be that, just over this month because it's Hispanic Heritage Month that we're learning about people who are Hispanic, which I just think means Spanish speaking, but like just the fact that there's so much more diversity to that, and especially here in California, which used to be part of Mexico, we should be learning a lot of, in my opinion, Mexican history as part of regular Californian history. And that Black History Month should not be the only month that you learn about Black people, and that our history did not start with slavery, then civil rights, then Obama, and it's all over. And everyone should be able to see themselves in it. I think that's low-hanging fruit, though. I think that the other day I got a comment from someone that said, there's a lot of race stuff on my website, I should dial it back a bit. And I'm like, no, because race is important, and it's because we dial it back that we find ourselves in these awful situations. And I know that a lot of people can't make the connection between distance learning and anti-racism, or what's going to be a really, like even with Prop 15 passing, yes, I'm 15, but probably a really significant budget deficit, that anti-racism and racial equity and racial justice lives in all of these things, and it can't be denied. So just like we're not unique, our school district has an extremely a huge disparity in school suspensions and expulsions for Black children especially, and Latino children next. And yeah, so it's there, but no one can really point to good concrete actions that the district is taking to solve it. And I hope that we're able to change that.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Hope you're up next.
So I think that the current and the closed past city council here in Concord has done a terrible job of social and racial equity. Even simple things they just ignore. I feel like Concord is a prime example of how a lot of the social issues have just been pushed off onto the police. I think it's predominantly because the majority of people who sat on the council live in like sort of our whitest, most suburban areas. And that creates just a situation where their solutions and the solutions they discussed are just coming from basically one perspective. So I many times I've, again, having seen the effect of having a more diverse kind of group of people that represent more diversity on boards and commissions. I've been down at the city council encouraging them. I did run for city council in 2016 before we had district elections, and there were 2 Latino young people who ran, and when the elections were over, they had applied to sit on several commissions, and our city council wouldn't even interview them. And I got up and I said, hey, here are 2 young people from the Latino community, and they're really interested and they have a whole new perspective, and you won't even interview them. And they just did nothing. So one of my short-term goals would be to try to get as many people involved as possible. And from all the districts, I want to show people how their district elections can help them run. So for example, I don't have to blanket the whole city. I don't have enough money. We're running a people-powered campaign. I don't have enough money to blanket the whole city with a mailer. But I do have people who are helping me, and it's much easier for us to cover just a small district. And I think that people in the districts can see that it'll help them get elected. But beyond that, I want to push the city council to appoint people from all different races, all different incomes, and also women. We don't have any women on the planning commission. And I think that it makes a big difference. Women are traditionally, even as we try to change it, they're traditionally responsible for children, sometimes responsible behind the scenes for paying the bills. And I think that how our cities are planned, also the way that we approach our perspective on crime, is something that it's a voice that needs to be heard. So then I also think that the city council has, for the most part, been controlled by the Police Officers Association. All of the people who have been elected were basically elected with the POA PAC money. And I think that that has driven a lot of the policy in Concord, and I'd like to see that changed. I do think that one of the successes, it's not the council's successes, but they are recognizing that that's not acceptable anymore, and that people are recognizing that that causes when you criminalize things, or when you put something under the police budget, you imply to your constituents that that is a criminal activity. And I would like to see some of that taken away from the purview of the police, so that we can demonstrate to the public, your elected officials, or people believe them. They believe that they're acting in their best interest, for the most part. And I would like to see us show them that homelessness isn't a crime, that it's not the police's responsibility to come out there just because somebody is poor, just because somebody is unsheltered, and that there's a better way to do it. So long term, I would like to push city staff and the council to analyze the budget and make sure that the budget covers public safety for all the communities, and make sure that when we're doing that, all of the community voices are heard. I just think that a lot of it spreads itself out into all areas. So our city council, until the pandemic, was very resistant to tenant protections, and I think that that is completely something that falls under this idea of their failure for racial equity. In Concord, we have a third of our population is Latino community, and so a lot of them are affected when you don't have tenant protections. And I just think that the city council has no experience with that. And so they just turn a blind eye and think that it will go away, even though those are some of our essential workers, and now they're having to see that. It's the same thing with affordable housing. When they make an effort to include affordable housing, but then they don't demand that the affordable housing get built simultaneously with the luxury housing, or they say things like, we want luxury housing downtown so we can have all incomes, but there is no trickle down of affordable housing. And for them, I just think that the social justice and the racial justice is caught up in multiple topics, and a lot of it was driven by the POA, and so a lot of it was just perceived as, for example, our current incumbent that I'm running against suggested that she did not support just cause eviction legislation because it would allow gang members to stay in rental apartments. And I was just horrified by that. And I want somebody on council who would push back on any kind of suggestion that just cause evictions have anything to do with gangs, or that anybody who's a tenant is automatically associated with gangs. So I just want to bring a new perspective and pull things away from the criminalization that we see in Concord.
Thank you so much, Hope. Really appreciate it. Tamisha.
So that was amazing. It was just amazing listening to everyone. So want to just say hats off to you. Your one vote. Right? Like, I've been saying that to myself, is like, what is the strategy? It's not just to get elected, but it's to win and sustain those wins over time for our people. And what that means is that we don't just get elected, we have to change the culture of governance, right? And so what that means is that you might be the only progressive on there. And so I'm thinking to myself, is like, what are the strategies we need to do on the ground around organizing and mobilizing the people who voted for us to make change happen, right? And build a strong base of political power that's steeped in equity and racial equity in particular, so that we can continue to move forward progressively, right? Antioch, look, it's hard to assess the history of Antioch. I hear from some people who've been here for a very long time that it used to be a sundown town. I've heard, it was a largely white suburban community, and then, became diverse overnight, whatever that means. Maybe they just didn't see Black people moving in. I'm not sure what it means, overnight means. You clearly see people, right? Or sometimes we don't, right? And so that's what I hear, that, became racially diverse overnight. It's been complicated, that the school board intentionally suspends and diverts young Black people into like away from quality education and into jail and away from, opportunity, and was once sued by the ACLU and the NAACP. That Black women who sit on the school board are constantly attacked every time they try to step up and do something for Black students in particular, right? That we had a Black mayor once, that, we had the first Black woman to ever be elected, right? And to the city council, and then more people after that. Well, I gotta tell you, making history doesn't mean anything if you can't make an impact. And so for Black people in particular, it's not enough to make history and be the first Black anything if we can't get equity for our folks. So when I'm thinking about, well, what could I possibly do in a district where, there's 22% unemployment, right? And that's in one community. And guess what? That community is largely Black, Indigenous people of color living in that community, and poor people, right? And that to me is really says something about what we invest in here in the city of Antioch. We also don't want to dismiss the idea that we have low income working families. People say working families. Sometimes I don't know what that means, because you could have working families living in their cars right now. So we have to really do something about economic equity here in the city. There's also this idea that Antioch is a tale of two cities, the haves and the have-nots. I have have to tell you, I've experienced that. It's unfortunate that our elected leaders have allowed that to go on for so long. We need to unite Antioch and bring everybody together. I will say, if there's anything such as a racial equity audit, I would love to do that when I'm elected to council. I would like to see our hiring practices. You know, I would like to see our hiring practices in every department. How many people of color are in each department? How many people of color apply and get rejected? I would like us to look at, when we think about small businesses and who's able to open a small business, how hard is it for a Black small business versus a white small business, right? Or any other racial ethnicity, right? So I think we have to really, like, I would like to take a deep dive into our city infrastructure, all of our policies, and be able to assess if we are the driver of racial inequity and racial disparity in this city. And then take some full responsibility to be able to rethink and reimagine our role. And that we have elected leaders who largely believe that they elected themselves, whether they're Black, white, or indifferent. So they don't advocate for anything at the level of the county, the state, or whatever. They're just comfortable being elected. And we can't have that anymore, because you have Black women are the highest unemployed population, right, in this city. That's unacceptable, because the way we're living now, I'm a Black woman. I take care of my family. You know, I'm a caregiver, right? I take care of the community. So how do you lift me up so that we can lift up the entire community? So I think those are some of the things. And also, like, how do we invest in youth development where we're addressing the needs of young people across the board in city government, early job opportunities, intervention to end the school to prison pipeline, the community to prison pipeline, community beautification. When young people will, like, take ownership of where they live, it looks better, it feels better. So how do we get organized and get young people involved is also something, and invest in young people is also something that I would like to do. I know we need a more balanced budget. We have debt that we need to pay down as a city. We passed 2 measures that the police association is calling police measures. They were not police measures. They were quality of life measures. They were workforce development measures. They were measures that were supposed to increase the quality of life in the city. And unfortunately, 12 million of that 15 million over 20 years is going to go to law enforcement rather than to the resources that we need to curb homelessness, right? And to do what we need to do in the city. And so we need to rework those percentages if we can. If not, we need to do another measure. And I know people hate to tax themselves, but that's what we do anyway. We tax ourselves to pay for law enforcement. So we have to, if we're willing to tax ourselves to pay for the very thing that is mismanaged and not working, in particular for Black people, brown people, and people in dark bodies, then we need to tax ourselves so that we can do something to serve those same communities at equity. And so when we talk about police accountability, is our police department diverse? And no, it is not enough to have a Black chief, because we are dealing with a system that is historically steeped in white supremacy and patriarchy, and we have to do something about that. So we need police accountability, we need training, we need equipment, and we need to stop using police departments as social work facilities, because they are not social workers. If they wanted to be social workers, they would have went to school to become a social worker, and we will put them, social workers, in our schools instead of police in our schools, which is another problem that we have here in Antioch. So I'm just hoping that I can have an opportunity to look at some of these things, address some of these things, and I'm hoping that other members on the council who are elected are open to more radical leadership. We have scared leadership right now, and we don't need that anymore. We need to be radical. The police departments are out of control and overfunded. That's not their fault. It's the fault of the elected leaders who don't have a backbone enough to say, we need to put money in the community, and how do we rework this to do our damn job? So for me, I'm like, that's where I'm at. I'm hoping that, that we can do what we have to do to serve everybody in our community, but especially BIPOC communities and poor people in the city of Antioch, because everybody is hurting right now. We could have used some of our CARE Act funding to help subsidize rents, so that when the rent moratorium is lifted, people won't be out on the streets and we won't be a contributing factor to homelessness. We could have done that, right? So I just think that that we need to address conservative Democrats. And I know people don't want to hear that, but I'm gonna tell you, that's who we've been historically electing, and they have not been serving us. And we have to do something. We have to elect people like Eduardo and Jovanka and is it Keisha and Hope and myself, so that we can start to kick the doors open for other folks, so we can actually get something done. So I'm hoping that we don't find ourselves as being one vote for equity come November.
I could not agree with you more. This is exactly why we asked you all to speak. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. Thank you. Addie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
As you all know, some of our cities are looking at reimagining public safety and criminal justice system. It's a hard work. And a lot of us are losing sleep over this work, but we're willing to do it because the lives of our children are at risk. The lives of BIPOC families are at risk. So if you can all just share with us how we can make budgets that are funded by taxpayer dollars. And when I say taxpayer, I'm talking about every single person, including immigrants, documented or undocumented, who invest with their hard-earned money. What can we do with these budgets that our taxpayers are contributing to make them more equitable within the positions that you're running for? And also, if you can add to that, what kind of collaborations and what roles do you see in these collaborations between cities and departments? How are they playing out, and how could we build those collaborations better? And if you see youth in this mix as part of this collaboration, I know two of you have already spoken to youth a little bit, but if you see youth coming into play, how are we going to reimagine public safety with them? So I'll start with Eduardo.
Hey, thank you for the question. Well, I think within our budget in the Park District, there's definitely a lot of questions there, and we've been demanding as a community more transparency as long as I can remember being an advocate around parks here in Bay Point. So one of the first things that I want to do if I'm elected is to offer that opportunity to have a discussion with our community about what the budget looks like, how we're spending the money, are we spending it responsibly? There's a lot of questions there of actually, are we doing enough to get more money into the community because of the situation we are in? I definitely feel that there needs to be investment in our youth. I'm a proponent of bringing in programs that include art. There's just a lot of graffiti that happens here in Bay Point, as in most communities. And someone who was raised here and has a lot of friends who went out and who's done great things in other communities in different cities around the country with their graffiti and their art. I want to bring them back here and I forgot who mentioned it. I think it was Tamisha who mentioned it. How do we get our youth to invest in our community, right? And we do that by offering them better programs around art, around music, around anything that includes something that's creative, because what's happening is that these youth here don't have anything to really lean on, especially in a community that doesn't have resources. As I mentioned earlier, we don't even have a high school here in this community. So what's it like? Imagine being a student here from Bay Point, going to a high school in Concord, and you can't stay after school as much as other kids stay after school. And your parent engagement isn't as much as it is in other communities, because the fact of the matter is a lot of parents are in traffic hours a day, and they have to go very far to drive to their work. So that creates a big gap there for us here in this community. I'd like to look at our budget and figure out how we could, quite frankly, our general manager is way overpaid, and he's told me in a private meeting that this community bitches about money too much. And so I'm like, okay, let's look at your budget. Let's look at your salary and see how we could, help the community, since you figure it's that we're complaining about the money. Well, let's look at how, how that's money's being spent, and figure out how we could, use it to invest in our community. There's just a lot of opportunity here in Bay Point that isn't being seized. We have, our incumbents who I'm running against, who, by the way, have refused to participate in any candidate forum that I'm in, have refused to even put a candidate statement in the ballot, and really just feel entitled to their seats. And so this, for me, as someone who's lived here all of my life, as I mentioned, and I've seen people that I grew up with have kids, and I've seen their kids be killed. I've seen their kids be part of violence, and I was around violence growing up too. I know there's a lot that needs to be invested in this community, and it doesn't include more police, I'll tell you that. It definitely doesn't include investing in more police, and definitely doesn't include, criminalizing our youth. And so we need to give outlets to our kids. We need to, like, as I mentioned about the graffiti situation that we have here in Bay Point, which is very rampant. Like, I've been dreaming about having a dedicated wall somewhere in this community where kids could go there and express what they're feeling, express, their art in a way that's meaningful. I love graffiti. I'm a child of hip hop. I grew up on hip hop, and I believe in the 4 elements of hip hop, and that includes graffiti. And it's a beautiful art, and I think we need to create space for it. And the same thing with music. There's a lot of things here that there's a lot of opportunity for kids here who love doing music, who love producing music, who love creating music, who love playing music. And I definitely feel that looking at the budget and figuring out how we could create those opportunities, and at the same time, really creating a space for youth to flourish, to think bigger, because we're so neglected here in this community that I think when the question was asked earlier, like, how is our history here of social justice and fighting for equity? It doesn't exist because people here just have frankly given up. We feel like no one's listening to us, and I think that's the attitude for most people in this community. So I'm very happy to look at that situation with the budget, have that town hall discussion with our community, figure out what are some ways to bring in more money into the community and invest into our youth, especially that group between middle school to high school, where, again, because we don't have a high school here, we don't have that community stable, that stable community that's reinforcing education. I think that's super important to think about, like, what are those creative ways to engage our youth here in our community. And I think it's by investing into them. So.
Thank you, Eduardo. Michael.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll go ahead and say the thing that the part of my platform that raises the most eyebrows, which is that I'm advocating that we defund the Walnut Creek Police Department by 50% or more. And to do that, obviously, over the course of a few years. But I mean, Oakland, Seattle, and Berkeley have already pledged to defund their police by 50%. And I think every city in the Bay Area should make that same pledge. One of the points that I make in Walnut Creek, one of the points that's raised to me is, well, if we defund the police, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to come in from other communities and start committing crimes here. And there is this narrative. I mean, here's a pretty startling statistic. 1.6% of Walnut Creek's population is Black, right? Very low percentage, which is in itself an injustice. But 18% of arrests are of Black people, right? That's a huge disparity. Taken as a proportion of the population, a Black person is 13 times more likely to be arrested in Walnut Creek than a white person. And so how do you justify that, right? There's one side that's like, there's only 2 possibilities. One, Black people are indeed committing 18% of the crimes in Walnut Creek. Or 2, the Walnut Creek Police Department is displaying the same pattern of racist behavior that we see from every police department in the United States. I think it is probably more likely to be the latter. And so this narrative of people coming from out of town, oh, these out of towners are coming here and committing crimes. It's hard to ignore the fact that that is a racist narrative, because it's not, no one's talking about white people coming from out of town and committing crimes. That's not who they're talking about. And in addition, that's part of the reason too, I think it needs to be every community in the Bay Area. Every city should make that pledge or a similar pledge. Because by reinvesting those funds into other services, that's going to be by far the most effective way of reducing crime. By giving people a better life, if we're talking about crime prevention, then making sure that everybody has the material needs met, their basic physical and psychological needs are being met, then they're going to be far less likely to commit crimes, and we're going to be a lot safer, and we're going to have a far less of a need for a police presence and police response to those issues. So that's kind of my big one is 50%. And then of course to reinvest those funds first into alternative services. So for example, in Walnut Creek, the most urgent one is a 24/7 mental health crisis, non-police response. You know, so that people like Miles Hall will never have to deal with the police again. And I think it's important to note that this is a non-police response. I think part of your question was about collaboration. And I'm going to kind of, I see it's for collaboration between cities and the departments, but I'm going to modify it a little bit because in Walnut Creek, they're starting to begin discussions about implementing a 24/7 mental health crisis response. They've just begun these discussions. And right now the police seem to be, it's very important to them that they are partners, right? So their vision of this response is that we have this response unit, and then every time we send one of them out, there's like a police officer in the car or who accompanies them. And so that's their vision for a mental health crisis response, is that the police are partners with this mental health crisis response, and they show up with them. And I want to be very, very stringent in saying absolutely not, no. It has to be a non-police response, because the fact that the police are responding to mental health crises at all, that's the problem. That's the problem. So why is a system where the police are now partners and they're showing up to these calls anyway? I mean, I suppose that's better than having just the police there. But I think if we look at Eugene, Oregon, the cahoots model there, which is something I suspect might be brought up again before this conversation is done. They have the cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, and it's a non-police response. You call 911, and if the dispatcher determines that you don't need an armed police response, they'll send cahoots instead, not with the police. And in 99.4% of those calls, the police don't need to show up at all. They don't require any police assistance at all. So as it turns out, there's a lot of things that the police are responding to that they simply just do not need to be there for. And I would say mental health crisis response is just one of many circumstances with that responsibilities that we should take out of the hands of the police and give to new departments instead. I would add drug addiction. I would add homelessness. I would even add traffic stops and domestic abuse. These are situations that we may think that police need to be responding to, but the data shows that they don't respond effectively to these circumstances. Particularly with domestic abuse, we see that they have a strong tendency to not believe victims of domestic abuse and to make decisions that put them in danger, sometimes resulting in further abuse, of course. And as it turns out, police are disproportionately themselves domestic abusers. So maybe they're not the best ones to be responding to domestic abuse situations. And I think there's just a lot of things. It's been said already that we are treating what are, in essence, social issues and health issues because our welfare state is so weak, because our safety net is so threadbare, and we believe that people get what they deserve and we don't need to support the people who need the support. So we don't give them any support, people fall through the cracks, and then what do we do with them? We criminalize them, and then we expand police powers for them to meet these issues ineffectively and violently. So what I think is so profound about the defund movement is that it flips this relationship on its head, and it makes us recognize that actually these are not criminal issues. We've been approaching the whole issue backwards the whole time. We need to simply care for these people and give them the material needs they need. And that's going to reduce crime. It's going to make our communities safer. It's going to make them more vibrant. It's a more compassionate response. And it ends up being cheaper too. So that's kind of where I'm coming out with this question.
Keisha.
I have had the opportunity in my career to experience two ways of going through a budgeting process that I think would really be beneficial to Mount Diablo. And one is, it's been less than 10 years ago, I guess, but Supervisor Wilma Chan in Alameda County introduced what she called human impact budgets. And so everything around this budget, you had to demonstrate what the human impact would be, both good and bad. And it was a very community-driven process. And she, again, was only one vote, but it helped her determine her budget priorities while she was on as a supervisor, and really bring the human voice to it, because I think that, as I understand, budgeting happens in Mount Diablo. It happens in the business office and it's presented to the board, and there may be a question and answers, but we, the board members, and we, the public, just take them at their word that this is the best budget possible. And I don't think it should be that way. I think there needs to be much more transparency, and that absolutely everything needs to be on the table. Los Angeles Unified, ginormous district. So like Mount Diablo is big, but we're like this big compared to LA Unified. But LA Unified several years ago started a process, and that they've been able to implement now for a few budgets, called utilizing an equity index. Again, this was completely community driven. And the community determined what equity indicators would be included in the index. And so it could be things like food security, homelessness, access to health care, asthma rates, a plethora of indicators. And based on those indicators and how different areas rate determines how money and resources go into those schools in those communities. And so by doing that, you're able to implement what's called targeted universalism. So we want great schools. We want every school to be great. But in this case, many schools will need way more resources than others to do that. And by implementing what's called the equity index, we could do that, because it would be, again, community driven and defined. We also have to agree that public education is a public good, and we all have a responsibility to pay for it. And that doesn't happen now. We're not all paying for it. Most of us, like, you know, people who have a paycheck or less than a paycheck are paying for most of it. People who are super rich don't contribute at all. So that has to change. It's a small change with Prop 15. I'll just keep doing the plug. I think that you should play a huge role because you're so much more imaginative than people who've been around for a long time. I'm excited that Mount Diablo Unified will have a high school member on their board soon. Students had to apply last month, and so there will be a member seated, I'm sure, before the new board members, the new elected members are seated. And so that's very exciting, and that will allow a student voice in those discussions, and whoever they are, I hope that we support them in helping them have a mechanism to hear from all of their fellow students. As far as collaboration between the department and city, I think the unique thing about school districts being governed by their own governing board is that people forget that, and they usually complain about schools to their city. They often complain about schools to their city council. They're like, oh, they go to public comment, our schools are so awful. And the city council, while they should be strong partners in public education, they have very little power and control over what happens at a school district. However, I think that this partnership should be strong and unwavering because we are a city council and a school board is governing the same people. It's just that one piece of this community has been broken out into its own governing board. And we really can't think about school, I think, separate from all the other issues, from housing, from food, from roads, from transportation, from parks and recreation. And so that collaboration should happen, that partnership and collaboration should happen at every opportunity that we have, and they should be strong. And I know that some cities have a stronger relationship with Mount Diablo than others that are within the district. And so I would hope that that we can change that and make them, each of them, strong.
Jovanka.
You know, as our sister Tamisha mentioned earlier, that it's going to take radical leadership, and that was putting it perfectly. We have to have political will if we are going to see the changes that we are fighting for. I see that often when we're talking about budgets and policies, oftentimes management are the ones who end up getting raises, but not the frontline workers. And so I think that when we're talking about fixing budget, making it more equitable, we have to look at the workers who are doing the jobs, and these essential workers are the ones that deserve to be paid what they're worth. When you're talking about making it equitable, how do we make the budget equitable? Then when it comes to AC Transit, as that's concerned, we make riding the bus free. We put money into mental health, after school services, like sports. Sports shouldn't be cost prohibitive, right? It should be something that everyone has access to. I had access to it as a child, and it didn't cost anything. I mean, it may have been. I mean, I grew up on a military installation. My stepfather was in the Air Force, and so we grew up on base, and everything was free. So why shouldn't that be the same case for everyone? Like, all kids should be able to have the same access that everyone has when we're talking about equity, right? So all kids having the opportunity for sports or dance or or art projects. When we're talking about defunding the police, it can't just be a phrase. When I say that, I mean that it's time for us to reinvest in our community. When you have cities, I think was it Concord, or one of the cities that one of you are representing, something like 60% of the budget is for police. That's ridiculous. I know in Richmond, it's 40% of the budget is for police, and we just can't have that, because we have to reinvest in our community and not just have police get all of the budget. And interestingly, one could argue, well, they're reducing crime. Well, that's not what reduces crime. What reduces crime is when people feel respected, when people feel that they have the resources they need. That's what reduces crime. When libraries are open, when kids can have access to all the things that I mentioned before, that's how you reduce crime. You don't reduce crime with a 40% budget, that 80 million of that is allocated to a new building, because that's what was going on in Richmond. That's not what reduces crime. And so let me make sure I answer the question. So, when you talk about youth services and how that comes into play, when we imagine public service, we have to bring the young people into the process. I know, Richmond, we have a wonderful youth center, the Rise Center, and those young people are very, very much engaged, and they are, their lived life experience should be, heard when it comes to creating the kinds of policies that benefit them and their families. I think I answered all of it. I really just believe that, we can have an equitable society. We can have a society that works for all of us. We can have a world that works for all of us, and not just a few people who have the means. Right now, we're watching the news about number 45, right, getting COVID, and he's in a hospital with the top, the top medical team of all the world, and, you know, all the best medicine and ways of healing him. Well, that shouldn't just be, you know, designated for the president of the United States. Everyone should have the same opportunity to be healed, and the same opportunity for the kind of medication that's going to put them back into, you know, into life, and being able to have the life that you know, we all deserve. And so I believe that when you're talking about equity, we have to have political will in all of these offices. And getting back to what I stated earlier is, and it won't get done when you have people who took police union money. It will not happen. And I don't care what they say. Oh, I took their money, but I'm gonna hold them accountable. No, you won't, because history shows that you won't. And even if you intend to hold them accountable by taking their money, you're not creating the kind of trust that the community is looking for right now. And so it starts by that, with candidates who are not taking money from the very corporations that are pressing us, and it won't come from candidates who are taking money from the police union.
Hope.
So I agree with a lot of what people said, and I'll try not to repeat it. In Concord, specifically, what I want to do is just systematically go through the budget and see what exactly it is being used for. We spend 60%, it's always between 57 and 60% of the budget on the police department. And the council tends to talk about that as if it was public safety. So I think public safety needs, it's unique to every community. Each community is going to have a different thing that they need for public safety. And so I would like to go through and see what is, separate out what are the police doing that would be better served by the mental health or the health community. What are the police doing that are not really public safety but property protection, so that we can see what, you know, what is it that we really need? Do we really need to be spending 60% of our budget on that? I'd like to have an opportunity to demonstrate how it could be invested. Some of that could be invested in communities and alleviate some of the fears that people have around using the budget for other things. And some of those things would be helping solve problems, so we're not just throwing money by criminalizing. So we could spend money on health, we could spend money on school programs, mental health, libraries, sports, and senior services. I think that the public would see that that makes for a safer community in and of itself. And I would like to incorporate multiple voices. I think that my campaign is incorporating multiple voices, and that we don't always all agree on every single aspect of what I'm in particularly advocating for, but we all try to come to a place where we're sharing those things. And we have to share the budget, we have to share our policies. But nobody's really talking about that on the Concord City Council. So another thing I would like to do is to have discussions at the council that demonstrate and show people how to recognize systemic racial injustices and systemic social injustices. And sometimes they just don't, people just don't pay close attention to that. And I feel like no one's willing to talk about it on the city council until now, because the POA had such a strong hold on them. One of the things that currently in our campaigning that the incumbent talks about is that says that in 1993 we had the same number of police officers as we do now, but we had a much smaller population. But the interesting part about that is not that we need more police officers, but that the response times haven't changed a bit. So I don't feel like that supports her argument that we need more resources for the police. I feel like it supports my argument that you are overfunding one particular aspect of the police. If it was the same in, you know, if you're basing your standard on 1993, then you're basing your standard on some real outdated data, and we can do better. And I would like to do that because I think it shows people who are complaining now, oh, there's too many homeless people. Oh, my car's getting broken into. I want to show them, hey, what you're complaining about is the way that it's being handled right now. And you're not allowing a progressive voice in there. And you're not allowing us to demonstrate there's other ways of using this money. So what you're complaining about is what's happening now. Let us try to find together a better way to more effectively use this that includes everybody. And I really feel like, you know, I many times I've brought it up to the council and just in our 3 minutes of public comment, and they're just blank faces like they've never heard anything like that before. And so I feel like I have the experience of seeing these things go on in other places when I was at UCLA, when I was in San Francisco, and that I can recognize it in a way that we can bring the discussion to everybody. So I agree with a lot of what was said, but just to sort of keep it short, I just was trying to emphasize what I would do in here in Concord.
Tamisha.
Yeah, I think everybody had some great ideas and definitely approaching the budget from the aspect of how do we divert funds away from systems that are not serving our community into services that will help people feel safe. What I will say is that most lay residents like myself, right? I mean, I've had 10 years of looking at budgets as a researcher and community organizer, and I'm always still stumped. So how do you expect the regular everyday community member who is just counting on you to meet their needs because they elected you to understand the budgeting process and where money comes from? The way you do it is you create a transparent budgeting process where it's participatory in that community is involved in those conversations, not just about where is the least equity and where do we put money to increase equity, but where does revenue come from? And how does small business and having jobs in your community contribute to your tax base and us having more resources? So I think what we need to do in Antioch is engage our residents in more participatory budgeting dialogues, and not at the city council meetings. We need to partner with churches and community centers and bring those budget conversations to the community. And we need to talk with community about what goes into a budget. How does a police department become funded over youth services? How does a police department, how do we attach our safety historically to policing when we don't have our very own fire station in a city that has fires every spring and summer? Why we don't have a fire department, right? So I think it's like raising these questions with community in community while helping community understand the budgeting process and bringing it to the community is going to be very important. Otherwise, our elected leaders are left to their own devices and guesstimating about what needs to be funded. When we think about what's criminal, I think it's criminal that transportation isn't free. I think it's criminal that people don't have access to quality health care. I think it's criminal that young people don't have access to quality education and youth programs. I think it's criminal that rents are raising so far through the roof that people can't stay in their own communities. I think it's criminal, right, that we are not investing our dollars in making sure that our residents have access to good jobs. So when we talk about crime, we need to talk about all crime, right? Also, how do we bring everybody together to work together? We also need to understand ourselves. Local elected leaders need to understand our relationship to the county, to state elected leaders, and to federal elected leaders, and how state, federal, the whole state, federal, state, county dollar system work so that we could pull those resources down to our community. We do not fund mental health. That's something that our county representatives are supposed to be advocating for and like pulling down to our community. So when you have, so if we can't just work in our independent city structure, we also have to work with our board of supervisors, our state and federal representatives to organize those dollars down to our community. And again, on the education side, I didn't know that mental health services weren't funded by local cities. And so what that means is that our elected officials are not pulling those resources down for us. And that's a problem for me as a resident. So I think when we talk about the budget, we should do education, we should get community involved, we should bring the conversation to community, and we should figure out how all these systems work together so that we can have a more equitable, balanced budget at the city level that will address all the needs of our community, but also making sure that elected leaders at every level are held accountable to pull those resources down. And so that's another thing you got to do, you know, in November, right? Board of Supervisors. I mean, some people got reelected by a landslide. I don't know how that happened when we still got homeless on the street, but we have to do something about it. So we need to participate in small D democracy in our communities and work with community to meet all of the need. A more just world is a world where everybody have what they need. And that's what we need to be fighting for. We need to transition from extractive economies and start to put work back into our community. And we need to reconcile ourselves to each other and the earth, because what we haven't talked about is our natural resources and how we're going to need those for future generations to come, so that we don't just fight for everything and then be environmentally devastated later.
Thank you, Tamisha. All of you have been amazing, and I agree that it's criminal that our local officials and even positions of power like city managers, staff that have the power to influence our local government, our city council, people's in power, they're not doing anything or enough to protect our most vulnerable communities. And I feel that they don't recognize the oppression that these families have been experiencing for a very long time and aren't willing to do anything about it. They're clueless, and they shouldn't have these positions unless they understand and know how to fix it.
To all of our candidates on our panel, thank you for running. It is not an easy task to run for a local government position, and it takes sacrifices, and it takes time, and it takes money, and all of your free time. And I'm really grateful that all of you are willing to make those sacrifices and are willing to run for office. So I just want to say thank you.
I agree. Thank you all so much. And thank you for taking 2 hours out of your evening to come and talk with us. This has been incredible, and I appreciate having all of your voices in the room tonight. I think it's clear that we need more of you, and I hope that hearing you and the work that you're doing and the passion that you have for bringing representation back to communities will help inspire other people to follow and run in future elections, and help them start to kind of rethink about what we're doing and what's possible. We do have a few more of these sessions like this coming up. June, did you want to talk about those, or do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, I can talk about those. So again, thank you. This has been an incredible evening. Really grateful for everyone who attended, and especially to our panelists. Our next session in this series is going to be with academic experts in macro social work and racial equity. That session will take place on Monday, October 26th at 7 p.m. So mark your calendars and look for our social media. We're Defund Concord PD across all platforms. We're defundconcordpd.org is our website. So again, you know, we're really grateful for everyone coming to this first conversation of Care Not Criminalization. So I will turn it over to Addie.
I just want to strongly encourage everyone to fill out your ballots as soon as possible. Many of you have already received it in the mail, and if you haven't, then you need to call the elections office tomorrow morning. fill them out, get them to the secure boxes that are spread out through Contra Costa County, or deliver it personally to the elections office. Andrea?
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We're really grateful for this conversation, and we would love to have your voice present in our work. Please email us at info@defundconcordpd.org, and you can email us for more information, how to get involved. Any questions, feel free to reach out to us. So we hope to see you all soon, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, everybody.